Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at Miranda Seymour's biography of Mary Shelley. I'm Colin, and this is Colin for Books. So a couple months ago, when I did my video discussing all the books I read in 2019, I mentioned Miranda Seymour's biography of Mary Shelley. I was almost finished it at the time, but hadn't quite finished it, and today finally finished it. What can I say about the book? Well, the reason why I read it, of course, was that I really enjoyed Frankenstein, which I read not too long ago, maybe about almost a year ago now, and I really enjoyed it. I love to read about the lives of authors. Now, with Mary Shelley, of course, there's the added attraction that her husband was the famous poet Percy Shelley. So it was, in a sense, a 2-for-1 for me. Find out something about the lives of both of these important literary figures. The book was excellently written, excellently researched. I think that the author, Miranda Seymour, I think she's a fine historian. I think she's thoroughly acquainted with the sources and the history, the historiography, reputation, the changing reputation of the Shelleys over the years, of different scholarship that's been done on them, different interpretations and so on. I find her interpretation believable. Again, I've only her word to depend on. I find it dependable. I should say I find it credible in that she really tries to read the sources, so Mary Shelley's letters and journals and novels and other writings, very closely. She doesn't paint a glowing portrait of her subject. I think she presents Mary Shelley for all her faults and failings, and for all her virtues as well. Again, I really enjoyed Frankenstein. I admired it. I admired its genius, really. And I think that Miranda Seymour, the author, she has a very... Well, she obviously admires her subject, Mary Shelley, but she presents a very modest and moderate picture of the woman. She, for instance, doesn't pretend that her other novels are great. She says that Mary Shelley wasn't a great poetess, for instance, and other various faults and failings, and she doesn't in any sense paint her as an ideal daughter, an ideal wife, an ideal writer, humanitarian, any of that stuff. But her picture is of a intelligent, maybe inspired woman of her time who lived the first half of it was very difficult, an unidealistic life, I should say, an ideal life. I think over its hundreds of pages, you can form a picture of Mary Shelley as a real flesh and blood woman, as the type of woman that you'd like to spend some time with and discuss intellectual matters over coffee, but not somebody that you, of course, would remember for the rest of your life, an unforgettable person. She didn't live an easy life. That was because of her parentage. Her mother, of course, is the historically significant Mary Wollstonecraft, the writer of the famous A Vindication of the Rights of Woman. And her father was a writer, decently famous in his own right, William Godwin. I think Godwin is most remembered today for his book, The Adventures of Caleb Williams, but he was also one of these political writers, an idealist like Wollstonecraft, his wife. Now, the two of them had very radical ideas about religion, about morality, about marriage, and so on, and the impact of these radical ideas was severe in the life of their daughter. And it's not hard to see why her life would take such a strange turn. And it's not really very hard to see with parents like that why her life would have been such an unusual one for its time. At 16, she fell in with the famous poet, Percy Shelley, and basically ran off with him at that very young age, and despite the fact that Shelley was already married. Now, at 16 years of age, that's pretty early on to set the course of your life forever, but that's in fact what had happened. So the unusual path that she and her ultimately new husband set off on was one that would create difficulties for the rest of her life. I have to remember that in the early 19th century, bigamy, divorce, all these things were not only frowned upon, but they were considered utterly inexcusable, and in fact could involve criminal liability. But today, of course, it's hard for us to look at a 16-year-old and blame her for all that much. But ultimately, the implications of her conduct, of her and her husband's conduct, had severe aspects to it. So Shelley abandoning his first wife ultimately ended with this first wife, killing herself. It's hard not to see things like that as the inevitable fruit of their strange kind of idealism, their anti-traditionalism. It's easy to form a very negative opinion of Percy Shelley in this book. I would be very much open to other interpretations, but to me, Percy Shelley is a despicable human being. You know, of course, people fall out of love, people break up, but with Shelley had some pretty strange ideas, and I think the strangest of all of them was his idea of, I think, what we call today free love or polygamy. He wasn't faithful to either wife. In the circle of Shelley and of Byron and so on, fidelity was just not really high on the list of virtues. And in fact, one of the more disturbing parts of the book I found was in Shelley's encouragement of his wife sharing her sexuality with his friends. I don't know if she ever did, but the fact that a husband encouraged that, to me, is strange to say the least. It got to the point where I was quite glad that Shelley died tragically at a quite young age. He was about 26 or something at the time that he drowned in a boating accident off Italy. Sorry, he wasn't 26, he was almost 30 when he died. I think I was thinking of Keats. But the author, Miranda Seymour, basically makes it seem like their marriage was doomed had Percy not died. But nevertheless, Mary Shelley spent the rest of her life unmarried and cultivating the good reputation of her late husband. Her husband wasn't a good person, in my opinion, and I think I could convince many people of that, maybe not everyone. I think I'll make a video of Percy Shelley by himself because I quite admire his poetry, to tell the truth, even though I find him to have been a rather despicable person. So basically, after Shelley's death, the rest of Mary Shelley's life is spent, as I said, cultivating a positive reputation for her late husband, but she also spent a lot of time writing. She wrote several more novels. None of them, of course, were nearly as successful as Frankenstein, although some people like a few of them to this day. Some of her other novels, of course, include Matilda, which she wrote in 1819, The Last Man in 1826, Valperga, which she wrote in 1823. None of these other writings were very successful in her life, and she was always known as either the author of Frankenstein or as Shelley's wife. But she did in fact write some history of literary figures in Spain and France and Italy. So despite the fact that her husband was from a wealthy family and was in fact, his father was a baronet, so a very low-level aristocrat, most of her life she spent in basically a hand-to-mouth existence. And it wasn't until her husband's father died that her son, her one remaining child, also named Percy, and they came into a bit of money, but they were never very secure financially. Part of that, of course, is due to the crazy, inconsiderate personality of Percy Shelley, really. But anyway, so the first half of the book moves along fairly quickly. The interesting backgrounds given for Wollstonecraft and Godwin, her parents, and the strange but interesting and at times depressing life, her early married life. But she was a widow, of course, for the second half of her life, and the second half of the book is rather slow. And unless you're a huge fan of her writings and interested in the history of women in the 19th century, I think, like me, you'll find that the second half of the book is very slow and not all that interesting. But that being said, the author is excellent, the research is excellent, and I think the interpretation is very trustworthy. So anyway, there you have it. Thanks very much for listening, guys.